Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast, where I speak to people who can help us understand the risks of human decision making. My guest this time is a British radio presenter who's previously been a publisher and a parliamentary candidate. He's got a brand new book out called Why Can't We All Just Get Along? Iain Dale is the host of the evening show on LBC, a national talk radio station here in the UK. US listeners who are expecting me to have a British shock jock are going to be pleasantly surprised, because Iain isn't a shouty presenter. He's thoughtful, polite, and a lot of fun. I wanted to speak to Iain because he's got some fascinating experiences to share about radio, in particular from what he's learned from doing his show, where the topics he covers are wide-ranging and you never know who's going to call in next. But he's also got some wider insights about why things are as polarised as they are and what we can do about it. I knew from listening to his radio show, links to that and his book are in the show notes, that he'd be an engaging and insightful guest. And he really was. A warning to those of you with a sensitive ear, one of the topics we talk about are the words you're not allowed to say on British radio, but you are allowed to say them on podcasts. So listeners who don't like expletives may prefer to skip this episode. Rest assured though, they're all in a good cause, and the most extreme one that's used, and it is fairly extreme, is highly pertinent to an exceptionally funny story. So if, like me, you've ever been interested in radio, or you want to understand how politics and the media works, or you just want to hear some really fun anecdotes, then you're going to love this podcast. So please enjoy my conversation with Iain Dale. So Iain, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And look, as I was thinking about this podcast, I wasn't quite even sure how to introduce you, because you've had a fascinating career, or even series of careers. And I wondered if you could just give my listeners a little bit of a sense of, you know, what you've been through and sort of who you are.
Well, I'm sort of a jack of all trades, master of none, but I suppose the thread throughout my working life has been politics and the media. Just very briefly, I grew up with a farming background, and I've always thought if I'd been born 10 years earlier than I would now be a farmer. But I intended to be a German teacher and studied German at university. But I got the political bug, went to work in the House of Commons, became a lobbyist, set up my own political bookshop and publishing company, ran a conference organising business, ran an internet TV station, started a political magazine, and then in 2010 I got a job presenting on LBC Radio, and that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. That provides my main income. It's the best job I've ever had. I just love being a talk show presenter, and I do a lot of political commentary on other radio stations, television programs. You've probably seen me on sort of Andrew Marr, Politics Live, Question Time, that sort of thing. So that is what I do in a nutshell.
And it's amazing. I mean, there was a period of time where you literally couldn't switch on a news channel without you appearing at some stage.
I know, even I was bored by myself. So that was really during the Brexit referendum, I guess. And I was on Newsnight so often. I actually said to them once, "Why do you invite me on so often?" And they said, "Well, we think of you as the thinking man's Brexiteer." And I thought, "Oh, well, I'll settle for that. I've been called far worse."
But it's fascinating. The energy that you bring, broadcasting, as you say in your book, which I want to come and talk to, it's an exhausting thing, because you're having to perform, and yet you sort of seem to have this superhuman ability to do lots and lots of it.
Well, I've always been somebody who doesn't need a lot of sleep. I've always had, I suppose, more than one job. And I just think that this mad life that I lead will end at some point. So I'm going to enjoy it while I can. And I think people always think I say yes to every invitation I get. I actually don't. I turn down a lot of stuff. And I've got to the stage where the glory of being on television doesn't feel like a glory anymore. So I do pick and choose what I do. But look, if I've got something to say, I want to say it. I do a lot of writing, even though I don't really enjoy writing very much. So I never pitch a column to a newspaper, but if they ask me to do one, normally I'll say yes. I have said no a couple of times recently, but it all feeds into the radio show. All the stuff that I do outside LBC is to encourage people to, or subliminally encourage people to listen to my radio show. So, I mean, I do a lot more punditry than most of my colleagues, but I think it feeds into high listening figures.
And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting about you as a broadcaster is that you bring your, it's either a very good sort of faking, or you bring your true self. And I'm minded to believe the latter on the basis I think it'd be very hard work to build that up. But you really bring your personality and a sort of level of honesty and, personal discovery. And you're not afraid to talk about contentious issues or sort of, experiences that you've been through.
Well, I do that for several reasons. First of all, I think I was told when I started at LBC, and I wasn't a trained journalist or broadcaster. I had to pick it all up as I went along. So I did take a lot of advice from people. And one of the pieces of advice I had was that don't be afraid to talk about you. Don't be afraid to talk about your life, your motivations. If you're going through a sticky time for whatever reason, talk about it to the listeners, and they will then regard you as a friend. And if you listen to someone on the radio, say 3 or 4 times a week, they do become some kind of ersatz friend in a way. They've never met you, but they feel they know you. And I get that when I do meet listeners. I mean, I get stopped in the street sometimes, and people know that I've got 2 dogs, a Jack Russell and a miniature Schnauzer. They know I drive an Audi. They know I'm a West Ham fan. They know I love the Eurovision Song Contest. Instant departure from all of the listeners to this podcast at that mention, I imagine.
No, we'll probably get extra ones now as a result.
And it's really important, and particularly I think over the period of coronavirus, I've noticed that more and more, where I've got far more emails and tweets from listeners saying, you really helped me get through this. And first of all, I thought, well, that's a weird thing to say, but now I get it. It's because it's that calm, reassuring voice. And because I'm not a shouty presenter, I don't interrupt callers all the time. I let them have their say. And okay, there'll be the odd moment when we have a bit of a stooshy, but generally, I don't like cutting people off. I mean, if they're talking absolute bollocks, then obviously I probably will. But I think if someone has lifted the phone to ring you, the least you can do is hear them out. So that's the reason I talk about some deeply personal things. When my mother died, I did a phone in on grief a week afterwards, which my producers were slightly nervous about because they know that I tend to shed a tear at Emmerdale, let alone things like that. And it was fine until about 45 minutes in, a call. I remember Dave from Basildon, I think he was. He said, "Iain, I can hear it in your voice." And that sort of set me, I can feel myself going now. So that set me off. But it is a bond, and you have to have that bond. So it is to sort of, I mean, in a sense, you're kind of grooming your listeners to tune in every single night to you, because you want them to know that you're not just going to go from one caller to another and ask them what they'd like to say and then move on to the next one. They're going to hear something interesting, even if it's on a subject that they're not interested in. That's the key to keeping them listening. You don't, I mean, bringing the title of your podcast in, you don't want to risk them turning off. And there are hundreds of radio stations that they can listen to. And there is no greater honour that I can have than someone says to me, "Iain, I'm a first-time caller." They have been listening to LBC for 30 years, and they've chosen you to phone into for the first time. And sometimes you can go through a whole programme just with first-time callers. And that actually, bizarrely, gives you a bit of a buzz, because you know you're connecting with the audience.
Everything you say resonates, because I feel like we're having this conversation the first time we've met, but I feel like I know you because I've heard all these things, and it's a very interesting medium, because in many respects you would have saw with sort of the prevalence of video nowadays that actually radio would be on its sort of hind legs. And actually, I think particularly as you say during Corona, it's had this massive resurgence because of that personal connection, and particularly speech radio and the kind you do. There's been a surge in listening. Well,
there was a fear that because of coronavirus and people weren't commuting anymore, that people wouldn't be listening as much as they did. But in terms of digital listening, I've got to get these statistics right. I'm pretty sure I was told that for the station as a whole, digital listening has gone up 40%. Wow. Now, that may be because people are now choosing to listen in different ways than they were before. I don't know. The website traffic has increased exponentially. So, I mean, I think we have kind of provided a bit of a social service. So we've started doing a mental health hour every week on my show, Don't know any other radio station that does that. And it has become an appointment to listen hour, 9:00 on a Thursday evening. I have a psychologist, Emma Kenny, with me, and she is just brilliant with the callers. And I'm not a trained psychologist, but I feel free to chip in. If I think I've got something meaningful to say to somebody, I will do so. I mean, we had one incident, though, which will forever burn in my memory, where it was about 9:45, and because I've been broadcasting from home over the last 4 or 5 months, I've gone back into the studio now, but occasionally the line will go down. It's only happened about 3 times, but one of those times was in this hour when we were talking to a man who said he was about to take his own life. So a bit of a bad timing in a way. So it took me about 2 minutes to dial back in, and I just typed on the screen for the producer, "I'm back." And in the break, he said, "What do you mean you're back?" I said, "Well, my line dropped," and they hadn't even noticed because Emma was rabbiting onto him, and so they didn't actually need my input for those 2 minutes. But I mean, had she not been there and the line had dropped, I mean, that could have gone seriously wrong. But people, it is amazing the things that people will talk to you about, the deeply personal things that they've never told another human being, and yet they're talking about it to you on national radio. And it's because they know, or they think, and I hope they're right, that I am a good listener. I can be empathetic, and that they're not. I mean, from a presenter's point of view, though, you always know that one word out of place and it can have very serious consequences, both for the person who's calling in and for your career. I remember when I was very new in the job, we were doing something on mental health, and a guy called in, Bill on the M25. This must have been, 2011. And I'd only been doing it a year. And he said, I'm going to kill myself tonight. I mean, what do you say to that? Particularly if you're not, I'm not Samaritans trained or anything. So I talked to her for about 25 minutes, which in radio terms is like years.
Right.
But of course, everyone listening was gripped. But I was very conscious that if I said the wrong thing, it could end up with a complete tragedy for him and me being taken to Ofcom and possibly losing my job. But I knew I had to end the conversation at some point. We went over the 9:00 news, which in radio terms you never, ever do. But you can't just cut someone off just because the 9:00 news is coming up on a subject like that. So at the end of the call, I said, "Bill, I'm going to leave you now, but I do want you to talk to my producer." So he then talked to Laura for about another 20 minutes. Then the next night he phoned in again. And by that point, obviously we were talking about HS2 or something, I don't know. And he said, "I want to speak to Iain again." And she said, "Well, you can't. We're not talking about this subject." He said, "No, I really do." And she said in my ear, "Look, he really wants to speak to you." And I said, "Well, put him on for the last couple of minutes of the hour." So he came on and he said, I did go through with it last night. He said, I can't remember whether, I think he said that he took pills, which again, you're not supposed to say on the radio, the methods that people use in case it encourages others. He said, "But I then thought about what you and Laura had said." Laura's my producer. And I phoned 999, and so I'm here now. And it's only because of what you said that I'm here. And then you kind of think, well, we did something good there. And I've had quite a few other occasions where I know that without people phoning into the program, they would have gone on to do something pretty drastic.
I mean, that's just an astonishing thing to have to deal with, particularly when you might not be expecting it. And I think one of the things that really struck me in reading your book was the sort of, and it's clearly not this sort of, oh, how hard can that be? Just sit there for 3 hours and spout. You sort of, I mean, you'd have to be pretty stupid to assume that that's all it involves.
No, but I do think people think that. They literally think I just sit there and talk, and how difficult can that be? And I mean, I think it's on literally the first page of the book. I explained that for 3 hours, I've got probably 5 or 6 things going on in my brain at the same time. And I'm not a woman, but I can multitask. And if you think about it, you talk, you're looking at the producer who's often gesticulating or reacting to what you're saying. You've often got the producer in your ear, say, particularly if you're doing an interview, suggesting what the next question might be. You've got your hand on the fader to either bring a caller down or bring a caller up. You're thinking, right, I'm interviewing a cabinet minister in 5 minutes. I haven't done any preparation for this interview because I've only just found out I'm talking to him. What shall I ask for the first question? You're thinking about the subject that you're talking in the next hour, thinking, well, how am I going to introduce that in the talk up at 59 minutes past the hour to keep people listening? Because the top of the hour is the point where if you don't give people a reason to continue listening, they may well drift off to television or another radio station. So you've got to hook them in. So you've got all of these things going on for 3 hours. And let me tell you, you are knackered at the end of it. I mean, it's not physically draining. Obviously, you're just sitting there. And sometimes I literally sit there for 3 hours without moving. I do try and in a break, I might go to the gallery and have a gossip with the producer or go to the loo or whatever. But sometimes, and I found this when I was broadcasting at home, I literally wouldn't move from my chair, even though like the bathroom is 5 yards away. And when I finish at 10 o'clock in the evening. I get the train home. I get home about 11 o'clock. I have something to eat. I sit down on the couch, start watching television. 5 minutes later, I'm asleep. And that is because I'm absolutely knackered. And look, compared to working down a pit, compared to doing manual work, okay, it's not like that, but it is a different form of tiredness, I think.
Well, I mean, it struck me that the cognitive load on you is enormous for all these reasons that you've identified, and juggling and sort of having to, and, it always struck me. I sort of always quite fancied a career in radio, and then I just thought, actually, I'm not sure I can control my mouth, not in terms of sort of swearing,
but just to the club.
but just sort of this idea that you might say something that sounds funny in your head, and you'll get away with it in the pub or in a sport. But if you do it on national radio, the as you say, the implications are huge.
Well, that is true, and I mean, I think I can be quite funny. But some of my producers take a different view, and that there is this joke that we're not called LBC, we're called LB Serious, and they kind of try and knock the humour out of you sometimes. But to my mind, I'm on the radio because of my personality, and obviously not everybody likes you, not everybody wants to listen to you. But I don't think I'd have lasted 10 years if I wasn't any good at it. And part of my personality is I have got that cheeky side to it, and I do say some inappropriate things sometimes. I don't. The worst moment. I just remembered this. I can't remember whether I put this in the book or not. I think I did. Was I got promoted to do the Drive Time show in 2013, and my first big guest on the first day was Justin Welby, the Archbishop.
You did put this in, but tell us, this is great.
Can I say the word on this podcast?
Yeah, please do. It's much better.
It was a pre-recorded interview because he happened to be in the building doing something for Classic FM. So I walked. He was already in our backup studio, a very small studio. And so I walked in, didn't even say hello to me, which I thought was bloody rude. And he just said, nothing on welfare reform. And I was quite taken aback by this because he'd written an article in the Sunday Telegraph, which was quite controversial about reforming the benefit system. So I was sort of thinking to myself, well, what do I do? Because surely I've got to ask him about that. But if I do ask him, he may walk out. He may never come to Global Radio again. And I've ruined the whole company's relationship.
And you're facing eternal damnation with the man having the man on the clock.
Actually, I forgot about that bit, but I don't really believe in that, so that's okay. And I'm ashamed of myself that I didn't ask him about it. I think now, being a lot more experienced, I would just do it anyway or find a way round it. So I wasn't very impressed with His Holiness, or whatever you call the Archbishop of Canterbury. So anyway, that was a pre-recorded piece that we were playing out in my first Drive Time show. And so I interviewed, what's the word? I introduced him in this way. Well, earlier today, I spoke to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. Actually, what I said was the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby. And I thought I'd got away with it, but I hadn't. Page 4 of the Daily Telegraph the next day. And my producer, who knew me really well, he said, "Did you do that on purpose?" I said, what do you think I am? That I would call the Archbishop of Canterbury a cunt just to get page 4 of the Daily Telegraph? I don't think so. So I think that's the worst mistake I've probably made. But, I mean, there are ridiculous Ofcom rules on swearing, and I do talk about this in the book as well, where I can't say bollocks, but I can say grollocks. Because everyone knows what I mean. If say, well, that's a load of grollocks. They know exactly what I mean, but obviously I can't say the word, but you can get away with that. There are some very tame words that you can't say. They have a sort of A list, a B list, and a C list. And if you say something even on the C list and there's a complaint, you really have to justify yourself as to why you said it. I can't say the word bitch. Can you believe?
Really?
I got dumped. My producer dumped me for saying, well, he bitched about it. Now, that wasn't calling a woman a bitch. It was just using it in the other sense of the word. But they're very hot on that sort of thing. But I do remember one occasion when this is probably an even worse word than the one that I just used.
Bring it on. We've already
we
gone
were
down
talking
that
about legalizing prostitution, I think. And a woman came on, and she was. I could tell that she was using quite fruity language, but she kind of, it was on the borders of acceptability. And she then said, and of course, many men just treat women as a cumhole. And it was like slow motion. And because I can dump the call, which means that there's a 7-second delay. It takes, because there is a 7-second delay, it deletes that 7 seconds from what goes out. But my laptop was in front of the dump button, so I couldn't sort of get to it in time. And I looked at my producer and my tech op, and they were both on the phone. I was thinking, well, I hope one of them heard this. Oh, no, they didn't. It went out on air. But bizarrely, I don't think anybody complained about it. I mean, you could say, well, it was in context, I suppose, as a defense. But it was one of those moments that seemed to go by in slow motion.
But I mean, just even having to read a list of words that you're not allowed to say, natural tendency in my head, the small child in me goes, well, I'm going to say those.
Exactly. And this is the risk where you risk your inner child coming out, or you're just in a cheeky mood that day and you think you can get away with it. Whereas actually, if one person complains to Ofcom and they think it's a serious enough issue, they launch an investigation. And in theory, you can get fired. I mean, remember John Gaunt got fired from... was it Talk Sport or BBC London, where he called a caller a Nazi? Well, I mean, not a particularly nice thing to do, but I'm sure he's called people worse than that. And he's never really worked again in mainstream radio from that day on. So there's always that little voice in the back of your head that tells you to sort of keep on the safe side of things. But sometimes the little devil in your head wins out.
But there's it's a really interesting thing because it is requiring you to, on the one hand, bring your personality, on the other hand, curb it.
Yeah, and
that's a very interesting balancing act, I'd have thought.
Yeah, and it does slightly depend on the attitude of your producers, because I mean, I've always got on well with all my producers. I think they might have a different view, but the two that I've got at the moment, Robbie and Kat, they completely get that they have to let me be me. And they've never put any pressure on me to change. Whereas others who are actually much more experienced than they are, if ever I started sort of joking about something, I'd get this little tap in my ear, or they'd say, move on. I think, and it goes back to again, the subject of your podcast, human risk, that some people are risk averse and others actually like to live a little bit on the edge. Most producers are completely risk averse because they know that if the presenter makes a mistake, it's them that are going to be held accountable for it, because management in radio stations is the same in all radio stations, that they don't like to upset the talent. Believe it or not, that's what I am, the talent. Can you believe it? I can't. And particularly with the bigger name presenters, I mean, they will get... I mean, Nick Ferrari, bless him, he will be able to get away with far more just because he is who he is. He's the biggest name on the station. He has been there for 20 years, and it's a brave programme. editor that is going to take Nick Ferrari to task for, I mean, if it was a major thing, obviously they would, but if it's sort of a little bit of a little swear word that goes out here and that, they're not going to sort of do anything, I suspect. But if it's a new presenter who isn't a name, I suspect they would get far more flack for doing anything wrong than any of the big names, and that's just a human thing. It's just normal human interaction. It would be the same in any other job.
Right. Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because you sort of, it's, if you've been around a long time, certain things are tolerated. And if you're, so I think there's a societal piece there around, it's natural that if you're new in something, the slightly different rules apply. And I think that's a dynamic that we see in lots of organizations. The senior people are allowed to do stuff. And we see this with politicians and scandals, and there's sort of different rules are seen to apply, and that feels fundamentally unfair. But it's the way that the world operates.
Yeah, and people rail against it from time to time, but in the end, human nature is what it is. Generally, people don't like confrontation, and they will run a mile away from it and try and find some way out of it without confronting somebody. And I mean that can change, and it depends on the strength and personality of the people involved, I guess.
And that brings us nicely to to your book and the tweet that inspired.
God, I was wondering when you'd get there.
I didn't build up. I'm waiting for some more inside radio stories. These are fascinating. But maybe we can get a few more swear words in before the tweet that inspired the book sort of talks about the fact that people are incredibly rude to you on social media in a way that they wouldn't be face to face. And that sort of sparked this idea of a sort of general dialogue around why is it people are so unpleasant in the current environment.
Yeah, that really is underlies the book. And the book it's a mix of two things. Originally, I don't know if you've read Emily Maitlis's book, Airhead, which is a brilliant book. And that gave me the original idea for the book, actually, because her book is essentially 40 chapters, 40 different episodes in her broadcasting career. And I got a quarter of the way through that, and I thought I could write this or a similar book. So I started writing down chapter headings, and like something she wrote would spark something off in my head, and I think, oh, that would make a good anecdote. So I wrote down 40 different chapter headings. And my agent, that sounds very grand, doesn't it? He had been on at me for ages to write a book, and we're throwing around various ideas, but I'm the sort of person, I've got to write the book I want to write. I can't write a book that somebody else thinks is a good idea. And I'm not, and I start the book off by saying this, if you're expecting this to be an intellectual tome, it really is not, because I'm not an intellectual. And everybody who's read the book so far has sort of said, well, I've read it in one sitting because it's a very easy read. I think that's a backhanded compliment.
It is genuinely a very easy read. I mean that in a really nice way.
Somebody, the head of the global newsroom in Scotland, Corey Martin, she sent me a WhatsApp message the other day. She said, I'm 4 chapters in. She said, I can hear your voice in every sentence.
No, I was going to say that because it really...
And I do write as I speak, which is probably not what you're supposed to do. But I thought, well, that's kind of what I was aiming for in a way. So we thought, I rang him up and I said, right, I want to do this Emily Maitlis style book. And he said, well, I've had an approach from HarperCollins. They want you to do a book for them. And I said, all right, okay. Thinking, oh, that's quite good. HarperCollins, big name publisher. I've made it. And their view was that I should do a book in response to James O'Brien's book, How to Be Right in a World Gone Wrong, last year. And I did think to myself, my initial reaction was, I'm not going to be defined by another person's book. If I write a book, it's my book. It's not a response to somebody else's book.
Well, you're not playing sort of literary tennis.
No. And so I went for a meeting with them, and they said, well, what about doing something on the decline of public discourse? Because you've written about this before. I did a big thing in the Mail on Sunday about it. And I said, well, I think I could combine that with the Emily Maitlis idea. So that's what the book is. It is partly autobiographical, with lots of anecdotes about radio and other aspects of what I've done. It isn't an autobiography, but there are autobiographical aspects to it. But the running theme through it is the way that we conduct our discourse with each other, the way we treat each other, how the internet has affected all of this. I suppose my conclusion is that, in a way, things are how they've always been. There have always been people on the margins who are much shoutier than others, and the internet has given them an opportunity to be much shoutier than anyone else. But if you it's populated by the kind of people who would go to public hangings in 1723. Those are the trolls on the internet. Those are the really nasty people who revel in other people's problems or misfortunes. And you're right, they are people who say things to you on Twitter, and it is particularly Twitter, that they would never say to your face. When you point this out to them, either they're actually quite apologetic because they can't believe that you've actually responded, or they go in the other direction and say, yeah, I fucking would hit you, mate. If I saw you, I'd knock you out, or I'd call you a cunt to your face. I mean, that is the level of discourse that those people indulge in. And I sometimes quote tweet them. I mean, I had a guy the other day I can't remember all the things he said, but it was pretty nasty stuff. And I just quote tweeted it, and I said, I think I've pulled here. And that then got liked and retweeted thousands of times. But what I've come to realize is that if I do that and I ridicule someone, it can be a profoundly awful experience for them because they're not used to having thousands of people descend on them. And I have worked out now that I haven't created this, but I have got a little army of people who will come to my defense and swarm on somebody who they think is having a go at me in an unwarranted way. Now, that's quite good from my point of view in a way. But I had one quite a long time ago, turned out to be a little old lady.
What?
I can't remember what she'd said to me, but I then sort of said something back. And so she got all these people descending on her. And it was clearly quite a traumatic experience for her. So I did think to myself at that point, you need to be quite careful about this because it's not fair. Those of us, I mean, if it's me and Owen Jones going at it, then that's one thing. But if it's me and Mrs. Miggins from 32 Acacia Avenue, Scunthorpe, it's a bit of an unfair battle, even though she might have started it.
But it is interesting because, as you say, they don't think about what they're unleashing, either to you personally. And you are, what I find really interesting is on the one hand, you're very open around yourself and telling stories. But you have to have a little bit of a sort of, a hide of steel sometimes to deal with this. Because if you took every single thing anybody said seriously, that could be quite hurtful. So you clearly have a resilience to this stuff.
You do have to have a resilience, and I'm not somebody, even though I like talking about mental health, I've never had any mental health problems myself, or not that I know of. But there was an evening not that long ago where I got into some row on Twitter. Somebody had said something, or they'd lied about my motivations, and I said, no, that's not right. And I explained, but they still kept on. And I was in bed with my laptop on my pillow at midnight, having this sort of Twitter spat with somebody. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And I then had a sleepless night about it. And normally I sleep really well. And I thought, well, is this beginning to affect my mental health now? These people, even though they aren't named, I mean, they've all got made up names. Half of them are probably Russian bots. Why are you getting so exercised about this? Just accept that people are going to be horrible to you, just ignore them. But it is really quite difficult. And I don't have a hide of a rhinoceros. Even I have feelings. And if I think somebody is sort of impugning my motives and I know that they're wrong, my natural reaction is to point that out. But there is also a trend that you will have read the bit about my fracas on Brighton Beach in 2013 with a nuclear protester, which I got a police caution for, totally unwarranted in my view, but there we are. And there's a video of that on YouTube which has been doctored to make it look actually far worse. All I didn't. People say I punched a pensioner. I mean that's the narrative now. What I actually did was pulled him away from a TV camera by his rucksack at the back. He turned round, tried to hit me, didn't connect, but threw me off balance, and we both ended up on the floor. And that was literally it. Yet the narrative has grown that I've sort of assaulted and punched a pensioner. I mean, apparently by the word of law, because I pulled him away by his rucksack, that counts as assault. I mean, who knew? So whenever I'm in the news for good or ill, and usually at the moment, thank goodness it's for good, the left then tweet this video all the time, and it's usually by accounts with fewer than 20 followers. And you think, well, who is coordinating this? So I just have a policy of blocking anybody that tweets that now, not because I'm trying to pretend it didn't happen. I mean, I write a full account of it all in the book. But that's their way of trying to get under my skin.
And, this theme of sort of the descent of discourse into very unpleasant places is what you pick up in your book. And I'm sort of fascinated by, because you talk about the media, you talk about politicians, you talk about social media and all these different pressure points. And I was really struck as I was reading it, sort of thinking, actually, we are really in a very interesting time where you have any one of these forces or dynamics could be nefarious on its own. Social media on its own has challenges, but the political climate, the media, all of those things coming together. I mean, we are in this really strange time at the moment where all these things are coming together and really driving us to a space that's unpleasant and not getting the best out of society.
I think we are. I think we've already got there. I'm not sure that we're heading towards it. I'm not sure it can get much worse than it is at the moment. And I think there will come a time when, if Twitter doesn't take action against this, and I mean, Twitter could get rid of all of these Russian bots if they wanted to, and they're not the only ones that are to blame. But when they didn't even take any meaningful action against Wiley for his anti-Semitic rants, you have to think they're not really taking this very seriously. So I took part in a boycott of Twitter for 2 days, which I did think I would have to go into recovery or something because I am addicted to it. But it's actually a lot easier than I thought it would be in some ways. So I think Twitter have a responsibility to do much more. It's not about censorship. It just is about improving public discourse. Instagram, which I do, but not particularly enthusiastically, Instagram is an oasis of peace compared to Twitter. Facebook has its issues, but again, I think is generally much calmer than Twitter. And not the whole world is on Twitter, and Twitter does not represent humanity or public opinion. We saw that on the day of the 2019 general election, when by 5 o'clock I was convinced Jeremy Corbyn was heading for a landslide because of Twitter. Well, look what happened. Look what happened. And that really did teach me a really valuable lesson. Do not let your opinions be swayed by what people say on Twitter. And you've got this whole trans debate at the moment, which it's one of those debates I tiptoe into very reluctantly. If you thought public opinion was represented by Twitter, we would now be banning the word woman or man. Right. You'd have to refer to everybody as a person with a cervix or a person with testicles.
Right.
Well, can you imagine if anybody on Twitter listens to this podcast, what I'm going to get now?
I won't clip that bit of the show, Ian, just to protect us from the inevitable. Or maybe I will. Maybe you want that. I don't know.
No.
But it is fascinating because it is, if you're on it, it can become all consuming, and you're absolutely right. You make the presumption this is what the world thinks, and of course it's the people you have chosen, either the people that you've chosen to follow, if it's the things you're reading, or the sort of the people that have chosen to follow you. There are vast swathes of the population that don't care about issues or have entirely different views that we just don't see.
Yeah, and I suppose I could change all my settings to only see tweets from people that actually follow me, and if I don't, if they're objectionable, well, you just block them. So, some people think you shouldn't block; you should just mute and leave them howling in the wind. I want them to know that I've blocked them,
right? Because I think it's a very powerful statement.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you get people say, I can't believe you blocked me. Why did you block me? And I think, well, I don't know. I'm not going to go back and look at the tweets, but you must have said something that I found pretty objectionable. And I do have a tweet which I put out every few months with my Twitter rules saying, if you insult me, if you swear at me, I will block you with no warning at all. So they can't say they haven't been warned.
But there's this astonishing thing where sort of, you see lots of oh, don't listen to his show, it's awful. And then they clearly are listening. So this is very weird.
And so I've gone over to talk radio like everybody else. Yeah, of course you have, because they've got 440,000 listeners and we've got 2.8 million. Yeah. I mean, I genuinely think that there is some campaign out there which sets these tweets up, because if they were right, we wouldn't have any listeners left. I mean, it's when Nigel Farage left, sort of all of his little fan club, well, big fan club, actually, and they were outraged because radio listeners are very conservative people. They don't like change. So when their favourite presenter leaves, they then threaten to leave themselves. But people are people of habit. And it's what I don't get is, well, why would you stop listening to a whole radio station just because one presenter leaves? I mean, I accept, look, I listen, believe it or not, I mean, whisper it, but I listen to other radio stations too. How disloyal of me. But I mean, I listen to people I like. But there were people saying, well, I'm not listening to LBC. I mean, I really like Iain Dale, but I'm never going to listen to his show again because he's on LBC.
Right. It's very bizarre. But it's a very sort of bizarre reaction, as you say. There's kind of, and I think there's this sort of, I want to be outraged and shout about something.
Yeah. And it's sort of, LBC has become Labour supporting and woke. Well, I mean, there are presenters on LBC that you could describe as having a few wokish tendencies. But is anyone seriously going to describe Nick Ferrari as woke or Labour supporting? I mean, if you go through the schedule, this is what I don't get. It's quite difficult to come to the conclusion that we support the Labour Party, given I don't think there's a single presenter on the station that has actually said, I support the Labour Party or I voted Labour. I mean, I'm sure there are one or two. I mean, if you divide it into left and right, you've actually got a reasonable balance, but isn't that how it should be? I still think there's more right than left. And some people are difficult to categorise, like Sheila Fogarty. And she's quite left on economic things, but on some social issues, she's quite right. I'm quite right on economic issues, but on some social issues, I'm more to the left of her, probably. Eddie Mayer, I could not tell you what his voting intention would be. Tom Swarbrick obviously worked for Theresa May, so he's on the centre right. Darren Adam, I think, is on the centre left. James O'Brien clearly is on the centre left. Isn't that how it should be? Having a bit of diversity through the schedule.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because if you ranged up the sort of criticism on one side and the criticism, you'd think you were listening to entirely different radio stations.
I know, quite. And people will not be convinced of it, though, that apparently I've become a wet, soggy liberal over the last 4 months. Well, who knew? I mean, there are issues that, I mean, I've always been as wet as a lettuce on immigration, for example, but that's not the last 4 months. That I've always been held those views. I've got liberal views on most social issues, and there are some issues where I've changed my mind because I've been on LBC. When you hit on universal credit, for example, when you have three grown men in a row ringing you up and breaking down in tears on the radio, you know something's wrong with it. So you can come out with all the theory as to why it's a good thing and all the rest of it, but the implementation of it is wrong. So I will call that out. Does that make me a soggy liberal? Well, if you want to say so, I mean, I don't really care. But I will call out things that I think are wrong. If I think Boris Johnson has done something right, I will praise him for it. If I think he's done something wrong, I will criticise him. And again, I think, well, isn't that how it should be? Do you really want somebody who, yes, I did stand as a Tory candidate once, but I'm not going to be slavish to what the Tory party says?
But I think that's a really interesting point because, there's that sort of this idea that you have to have tribal loyalties. And therefore, if, this blindness that seems to be happening and you can see it in the US with Trump, stuff that, everything he does is either brilliant or appalling. And of course, life is a bit more nuanced, but we have this sort of footballization of the world where you have to, if your team does something, you have to stand behind it.
Exactly. Well, it's always been like that to an extent because politics is it's about tribes, and the two main tribes are at war with each other over winning elections. Now, that is democracy. But I do think, and this really forms a major part of the book, and you use that word nuance there, which is probably the word I use most in the book, in that there is an absence of nuance in most debates at the moment. It's black or white. No shades of grey. You like nowadays to listen to people in your own echo chamber rather than have your views challenged. Not everybody, but that's a growing tendency for that. So in America, people on the right watch Fox News. If they're on the left, they'll watch MSNBC or CNN. And that is happening here now, where I get a lot of people saying, yeah, I'll listen to you, Ian, but I won't listen to James O'Brien. And you think, well, if you don't listen to presenters that you disagree with and have your own views and opinions challenged, how can you then form the right arguments when you're debating your mate down the pub on a Sunday night? All you're doing is just having your own opinions reinforced. You think you're having them validated. Actually, you're not at all. And when you come up against somebody who's really going to challenge you, you're going to be left empty-handed in terms of arguments. So I like to listen to presenters who probably irritate the hell out of me with some of their views. But on the Brexit debate, I supported the Leave side of the argument, not because I knew I was right. It was because I thought I was right, but I had to argue why I thought I was right. And to do that, I had to understand the arguments of the Remainers. And I wasn't somebody who came to this as a sort of somebody who had supported leaving for 20 years. I only decided in the February after the abortive negotiations, which David Cameron carried out. So I was maybe in a better position to see the other side of the argument. And I could say they were perfectly valid arguments. Even now, I will recognise Remain arguments as perfectly valid. I just didn't happen to agree with them. But I think because I understood that, I could argue in a very different way to the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg or Andrew Bridgen, who were ideological about it. And I'm not a particularly ideological person. Perhaps it's a weakness to be able to understand the other person's point of view a little bit too much sometimes.
But I think that's a lovely depiction. And I'm on the opposite side of the Brexit piece, but I've always found you to be, you're worth listening to because it's not ranty and kind of, it's nuanced and thoughtful. And actually there's probably a heck of a lot of stuff that we agree on. And I think there's this polarization piece where, we saw this with Jeremy Corbyn as an example. It was held up that he was consistent and, had standards and value. And I sort of look at it, if you're never prepared to change your mind on anything or have any kind of let an alternative argument sway you even slightly, that's a bit weird.
Well, it is weird. And of course, we knew that he hadn't really changed his mind on anything since 1983. And so we all also knew that he really supported Brexit. And I'm still convinced to this day that he voted Leave. But of course, he knew, and he was actually, to be fair to him, he was quite successful in keeping the Labour Party together on this because, and if you remember back in the 1980s, Labour wanted to leave the EU. I remember doing debates with Labour people at university where I was saying we should stay in the EU and they were all saying we should leave, and how the worm turned on both sides. But I mean, he right up almost until the last minute, he managed to have this sort of slightly nuanced position, which nobody really knew what it was, but it just held his party together, sort of. But in the end, it had to collapse like a house of cards. And that was one of the reasons that they did so badly in the 2019 election, because their position, I remember being on Question Time with Emily Thornberry, where she had to outline this ludicrous position that they had, which I'm now trying to remember the detail of, but it was just so contorted. And I remember just leaning over and saying to her, live on television, you do realise that everybody out there will think that is just utterly preposterous, and the whole audience broke into applause. And it was quite a moment, because you thought, well, I'm not sure. She's an intelligent woman. She can't believe this rubbish that's coming out of her mouth. But that was a position that Keir Starmer had given them. And of course, look who's leader of the Labour Party now. I mean, and he's done very successfully. But you see, if he's going to win all those so-called red wall seats back, they're going to remember that.
But I'm struck by your, so you went into politics and stood for election, and I can't help wondering, as I was reading the book and sort of as you were talking, I was saying, actually, would you have survived as a politician given your willingness to sort of change your mind on things? Because it seems to me now that there is this loyalty that's required, and you want to try, and you see this in some of the interviews where utter nonsense, calling the UK's response to coronavirus world beating is unparalleled nonsense, and yet you see these people spouting this stuff. And I can't see you as a politician being willing to go along with that.
Well, we'll never know, will we? Look, when I was much younger, I either wanted to be an MP or a radio presenter. And I've got half of the deal. I would have liked to have been an MP. I think in many ways I'd have been a good MP. I would have been a good constituency MP because I really liked that side of it. Would I have succeeded in Westminster? Now that is a really good question, because you do have to toe the line to climb the greasy pole, if you want to mix a few metaphors. Yeah, quite. And I think I would have been a bit of a whip's nightmare. And if you're a whip's nightmare, your card is marked. And although when I stood for election, being a minister was not at all important to me. I never particularly wanted to be a minister. But now I think that, because I did think about standing again in 2017, briefly, but then I got sensible again. Now I think I would have wanted to be a minister, because the only way of really affecting change is to be a minister. You can have influence if you're a backbencher, but only at the margins. And I remember I published a book by Gillian Shepherd once, former education secretary, where she had risen through politics from parish councillor to district councillor to county councillor to MP, junior minister, cabinet minister. And she said that at whatever level of politics she was, she found that the power resided in the level above her. And I thought that was very revealing. Now, you could argue, well, maybe she wasn't grabbing the levers of power at the level that she was. And maybe there is some validity to that. But a lot of people think, and a lot of backbench MPs say this to me. In fact, one or two ministers have said it to me, that they think doing the job I do, I have more influence on things than a backbencher does. Now, I've always resisted that in some ways, but if I ring a cabinet minister, they will take the call. And I have done things for listeners where they've come on the radio or they've emailed me with a particular situation, and I have rung a cabinet minister and said, I don't know if you know that this is the case, but this is what's going on, and it shouldn't be going on. What can you do about it? And there have been occasions when I'm not going to say that they've necessarily changed the law, but things have happened to help this person out of the hole that they were in. I mean, I'll give you an example. On the bounce back loan scheme that they announced, and they said, oh, yep, you apply for it, it's automatic, you get the money in your account within 48 hours. Well, HSBC were not playing by the rules on that. And there were many, many businesses that weren't getting the money at all. And one person contacted me, and I didn't speak to the Chancellor himself. I spoke to one of his special advisors, and I said, you might like to give HSBC a bit of a kick up the arse. Now, 48 hours later, the money was in his account. Now, I don't know whether there was a direct correlation between that or not, but I can do things like that. And I have influence in the way that I can interview politicians and hold them to account. So I have come to realise that you can effect change in some ways, and it's better to be doing it this way probably than being a backbencher, where if you take something too far, one of the whips will say to you, well, if you take this any further, you won't get a job at the next reshuffle. And I think I would have found that quite a difficult tightrope to walk, if I'm honest. But then again, if Nadine Dorries can be Minister of State, frankly, because I used to say, well, I think I'd have been the male equivalent of Nadine Dorries, rebelling on everything, shouting my mouth off. But she's now one rank down from the cabinet. So maybe it hasn't been a bad thing for her after all.
But that's a really interesting depiction of your role as sort of, because it's the role that the press has traditionally played. If we go back to a sort of perhaps a press that was less polarized and there was a bit more sort of, more of the sort of rigorous journalism rather than some of the sort of political tribalism that we see in the press. But you're fulfilling a similar role to that in many respects in terms of what you cover on your show and the audience that you have and your ability to push an agenda.
I'm not sure I agree with you about the press being more polarised than it used to be. If you look at the Telegraph, bear in mind Boris Johnson used to be a columnist on the Telegraph. I mean, they have not been 100% cheerleaders for him. They have taken him to task on quite a lot of things. You look at The Sun, which people see as a conservative paper, and in latter years it has been, but it went through the whole of the Blair, most of the Brown years, supporting Labour, and they don't hold back if they think the government's got something wrong. The Daily Mail, for example, the campaign that they have that launched against Robert Jenrick, the Communities Secretary,
right,
I think it's quite difficult to say that just because a paper is seen as broadly on the right, they automatically toe a conservative line. I think that is possibly less true now than it used to be. I mean, the Times, also seen as a centre-right paper, they don't hesitate in going for the government on particular issues if they want to. And in the broadcast media, obviously, there are regulations that people have to stick by. And although I, as a presenter on LBC, am encouraged to express opinions, I still have to allow the other side to put their opinions forward. And I happily do that, because I always say, I don't want people just ringing me up agreeing with me. How boring is that? I want to be challenged. I want people to disagree with me. I mean, there are radio presenters who just delight in the narcissism of having people agreeing with them all the time. I'm not one of them. Because I think it makes for very, very boring radio. I know Nigel Farage found that, I think, quite difficult at first, because his fan club would want to ring him up because they want to talk to their hero. And he loved a bit of an argument, and he was very good at charming people into submission in an argument. People who had rung up to have a real row with him found themselves saying, oh, he's actually not that bad, really, is he? And I think you have to surprise people sometimes. And if somebody on the left makes a really good point and I find myself agreeing with it, I will say so. And I just think this whole tribal aspect of our discourse now is something that everybody needs to look themselves in the mirror on and think, well, am I really going to go down this road myself? And I hate it when I'm interviewing a politician that does this, just comes out with all sorts of... I remember once I was sitting in a television green room waiting to go on, and there was a government minister there ranting and raving about the fucking fucking Brexiteers, I think it was. And then he goes on the television and says, well, of course we've got to bring the country together and be nice to you. And you think, you fucking hypocrite. But the media's just as bad at this. Robin Cook, I remember once, was telling me an anecdote. He was on breakfast television. This was obviously donkeys years ago. And they rang him up to do a pre-recorded thing. I can't remember what it was on. And so he did a sort of soundbite for them. I mean, it was, I don't know, a minute or two. And he happened to see it the next day when he was watching the programme. And they played, I think, 10 seconds of it. And then the journalist ended it by saying, and that was Robin Cook indulging in a typical bit of soundbite politics. So the viewer then has an immediate negative opinion of Robin Cook based on what that reporter, in inverted commas, has told them. And so sometimes politicians just can't win. And I really resile against this whole drift towards sound bites, particularly in the media, where if you do a 3-minute interview with a politician, you know what you know that they're only going to say a couple of things and they've already prepared them before you even ask the question. So whatever question you ask, they will come out with their prepared answers. And the joy of doing my time slot is that I can do much longer interviews. And I find that if you do a half-hour interview with somebody, after 5 minutes, they've got to say something different because they've run out of all of their pre-prepared stuff. So often you do half an hour, and the producers are panicking because you haven't got any kind of newsline out of them after the first 25 minutes. But I invariably find that in minute 27, 28 or 29, they then give you a good newsline. Now, you are slightly flying by the seat of your pants there, because there are sometimes when you don't get anything at all out of half an hour. But I tend to regard interviews as conversations rather than gladiatorial interviews, because I just think if you are aggressive with anybody, forget whether it's a politician, doesn't matter who it is, if you start being aggressive to me in this, I'm going to put the shutters up and I will just give you really boring answers. Right. Which some people might think I've already done. I don't know. But it's just human nature. You've got to think of politicians as human beings, because they are. They lead very normal lives. They're not sort of on some pedestal. They do go down to Aldi just as everybody else does. They've got a mortgage just as everybody else does. They've got a dog or whatever. They lead comparatively normal, well, most, obviously not Jacob Rees-Mogg, but most of them lead very, very normal lives. And they will have they can be hurt in the same way as anybody. You can make them laugh in the same way as anybody. And what you want is a politician just to be themselves, not some sort of robot. And there are too many robots who've they've been trained or they've self-trained to survive. And you survive by giving the party line on everything. And if you deviate from that, you're seen as a little bit unsafe.
Iain, I think that's a brilliant note on which to end, because clearly you haven't been programmed by anybody and are incredibly natural and engaging. I will put links to your radio show for those that don't already listen and the book in the show notes. But thank you so much. That has been entertaining, informative. And I think, as you mentioned, your character really comes out in the way that you write the book. And I enjoyed it in one sitting, and I know that my listeners will as well. So thank you so much, one, for writing the book, because it was really thought-provoking, but secondly, for being such a great guest on the podcast. We should actually mention the book title, shouldn't we? Go ahead, plug away, sir.
Why can't we all just get along, shout less, listen more? It's published this week by HarperCollins. And if you want a signed copy, rather than just buying a normal one from your independent local bookstore rather than Amazon, obviously, you can order it from politicos.co.uk. And I not only sign it, I package it up and send it out to you with my own fair hands. I can't say fairer than that.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for that. I've got my own copy, which was signed, and I can attest that it comes nicely in what looked like an Iain Dale packaging. So
it was.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So that's it for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My massive thanks to Iain for appearing and to you for listening. If you want to find out more about Iain's book, Why Can't We All Just Get Along? There are links to that in the show notes. Equally, I've put links to his LBC show for those of you that haven't yet heard it. Highly recommended listening. And of course, it's available on the web, so you can listen to it wherever you are. I will be back with another episode of the Human Risk Podcast very soon. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this. And if you did, please do leave a review on your platform of choice. Really helps to get the show out there and for me to continue to attract guests like Iain. So thank you for those of you that have done that. If you haven't, please do leave a 5-star review. Otherwise, I'll see you very soon on this channel for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.